Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII, Vass from Far Cry, Andrew Ryan from Bioshock, GLaDOS from Portal, Flowey the Flower from Undertale. What do all of these iconic gaming characters have in common? Yep, you guessed it, they're all villains. Antagonistic characters have been a cornerstone of storytelling since long before the written word, and many of the most influential and beloved people in all of fiction aren't in fact the good guys, but the very characters we're supposed to be rooting against. Of course, video games are no exception. We're attached to these characters because they're often the ones that have the biggest personalities, the most screen time, and take center stage in any game's biggest moments. A villain is a step above your run-of-the-mill boss fight. They're a character, someone that you as the player can develop a bit of a relationship with as you play. But what elevates a villain from a mere justification to go and shoot things to a persona capable of carrying entire games on their own? It's a more complex question than it would initially appear. Simple logic says that a good villain is one you hate enough to want to take down for good. After all, that's how most of the baddies I mentioned earlier work. They're bad people who have done or will do bad things, so you feel morally obligated to take them down and have fun doing so. But this theory doesn't hold true for everyone. A lot of the most compelling villains in all of gaming are sympathetic or at times downright likeable. What characteristic do they all share? Well, I think a good way to find out will be to take a look at two very similar groups of video gaming baddies, one that works and two that don't, to find out that secret ingredient. Borderlands 2 is dominated by Handsome Jack, while Borderlands 3 has the Calypso twins, Tyreen and Troy, for its central antagonists. Both sets of villains are charismatic, have appropriately evil plans and interesting aesthetics, but one is infinitely more successful as an antagonist than the other. I don't even like Borderlands that much, and even I have to admit that Handsome Jack carries his respective game on his well-sculpted face, whereas the Calypsos are a boring blight on an already flawed game. So why don't the Calypsos work as baddies? Well, it comes down to the nature of the conflict they portray. All villains need to have conflict with the protagonist in some way, and it's through this relationship that the story advances. But the writers of Borderlands 3 couldn't seem to get a handle on what the Calypsos want and how that ends up bringing them into conflict with the rest of the cast. Tyreen and Troy love telling you how evil they are over the comms, and the duo will beat up a side character now and again, but in terms of an organic conflict that we as players can really get our teeth stuck into, we're not left with much. The main plot of the game involves a treasure hunt to stop Tyreen becoming a god, but despite being powerful enough to amass a seemingly inexhaustible supply of cultists and to win cutscene fights without breaking a sweat, they never really present much in the way of tangible opposition to what the player, or the protagonist, wants to do, which is mostly just kill stuff and get shiny new guns. Without a sense of animosity or conflict between the protagonist and the villains, it's almost impossible to get invested in beating them or take their actions seriously. In short, the Calypsos fail as villains not because their weird streamer theme is played out or because their story doesn't make sense, they just don't really seem to care about the player and we're given no reason to care about them. Without a conflict, there isn't much of a story. Handsome Jack's whole deal, on the other hand, is that he hates you for playing Borderlands. No, I'm serious. He wants to make Pandora nice and orderly, and you as the kleptomaniac murder hobo mercenary that you are, stand in direct opposition to his plans, just by playing the game how it's intended.
You see, I just can't have some psychopathic murderers getting to the vault before I do. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's cute that y'all think you're the heroes of this little adventure, but you're not. You're bandits.
Not only do Handsome Jack's plans pose a tangible threat to the player's goals, his jabs and insults are that much more effective at building up a sense of animosity because his elitist perspective is justified. You are barely better than the bandits you spend the first half of the game indiscriminately slaughtering. Jack killing side characters and his gradual turn from aloof and smug to vengeful carries that much more dramatic weight because the conflict between you two feeds into itself organically. You, as a player of Borderlands, want to loot and shoot, Handsome Jack wants to kill you to stop you doing just that, and the rest of the plot evolves as a consequence of this simple dichotomy. Handsome Jack works as a villain because his primary conflict isn't with the other characters in the game, or really even with the player avatar, but the player themselves, and I think it's in this relationship the great video game villainy lies. Video games are uniquely placed to make the most out of their villains. In nearly all other forms of media, we as an audience are expected to sit back and watch the antagonist and protagonist duke it out. But in video games, we as players take on a much more active role in the narrative's conflict. More often than not, we are the protagonists. In order for a game to portray a compelling villain who's satisfying to go toe-to-toe with, they need to conflict first and foremost with the player, because it's our conflict with the game, and by extension the villain, that drives the narrative forwards. Even the villains of older games, with much more simplistic stories, engage with this idea. No one remembers Donkey Kong as a villain because we as players never really had that much of a stake in his King Kong rip-off antics. What we do remember is the way Ganondorf felt like an unstoppable, ominous force of evil during the kids segments in Ocarina of Time, and the way Bowser loves to taunt you and plaster his face everywhere in the best Mario games. These guys stick in our memory because they implicitly, or explicitly, challenge the player constantly. Many of gaming's most famous villains engage with this player versus game opposition very directly. Andrew Ryan and Atlas from Bioshock, for example, are all about manipulating the player into doing what they want and making you hate them by attacking your perceived sense of agency. As players, the satisfaction we get from making tactical as well as moral decisions is one of the primary sources of our enjoyment. So the idea that these actions might not be our own is deeply unsettling, and the desire to regain that sense of security and control makes the quest to hunt down the villains of Bioshock incredibly compelling, even if the final boss is basically complete garbage. Kreia from Knights of the Old Republic 2 and Flowey from Undertale are great metafictional villains too, because not only do they have relatable perspectives and nuanced character motivations, but when they call the player out for cheating or being nice for selfish reasons, they're criticizing you specifically.
And that is my lesson to you. Be careful of charity and kindness, lest you do more harm with open hands than with a clenched fist.
Making your eventual confrontation with them and your journey to prove their warped worldview wrong a much more personally meaningful one. Of course, not all gaming villains need to engage with the player in quite such a literal sense. Well-designed baddies don't have to be explicitly metafictional, but it does help to keep the player's experience and goals in mind when writing them. Depending on the kind of game, a player could want to feel powerful, explore new places, or simply progress with the story, and creating a villain that stands in the way of one or more of these goals is a great way to instantly build up some of that all-important animosity that's key to a sustainable conflict. Bumface, or as he's more often known, Gary Oak, is a classic example of this kind of villain. In Pokemon, your primary goal is to both catch them all and become the very best like no one ever was. Gary, crucially, has the exact same goals, and constantly competes with you over the course of the game, usually being one step ahead the entire time. Not only does he have a tendency to surprise you, but he's also got high-level teams of rare Pokemon like Abra, Gyarados, and Growlithe, as well as a starter Pokemon that has a type advantage against yours. He's a constantly evolving threat, right up until the end of the game, where he's become champion of the Pokemon League before you. This rivalry as a driving force to become ever stronger is something that none of the other Pokemon games have managed to replicate, with most of the characters that fill the same role as Gary being a little bit too nice and supportive for you to really get motivated to beat them in your next battle. A more niche example will be in the case of Shadow Man from the original Prince of Persia. This weird evil doppelganger's whole purpose is basically just to screw with you, and always at the most inopportune times. For example, he'll steal this potion you worked very hard to get and close a gate to stop you progressing. He's got no dialogue and no real backstory to speak of, but I so badly wanted to get revenge on this little bastard that it took me a while to figure out how to beat him in the final confrontation at the end of the game. Which I won't spoil, it's actually quite a nice puzzle. Villains don't always have to be some sort of omnipresent rival though. Some of our favourite video game villains only appear once or twice, and it's in just a handful of really intense encounters that they're able to build up a great conflicting relationship. A lot of the fan favourite bosses in Dark Souls meet this criteria. The Smelter Demon, Snorlax and Pikachu, or the Nameless King don't have much in the way of lore or main story significance, but they're made legendary by the struggle we go through to eventually beat them. In Dark Souls 2, the main villain, Nashandra, is pretty forgettable, despite being the driving force of the narrative and a pretty interesting character if you delve into her backstory, because she's just such a pushover. The Fume Knight, on the other hand, some random optional boss fight found deep in the second DLC, is a character I'll always remember facing off against because of how darn tough he is. Over many attempts and just as many deaths, I gradually got to know him, and that build up made my eventual victory all the more meaningful. Whilst a little bit more controversial, semi-scripted boss fights that you're not supposed to beat can create very memorable villains even if they've only got a small screen presence. Jetstream Sam in Metal Gear Rising is an utterly lethal opponent your first time facing him, and immediately knocks you down a few pegs after your first boss encounter. This makes your real fight with him towards the end of the game feel like the culmination of your journey, and makes the humiliation you suffered getting there completely worth it. That's not to say that making players feel frustrated or challenging their skills is the only way to create a compelling villain. By appealing to a player's emotions, players not only become more invested in triumphing over a villain, but are more likely to pay attention to their actions and what they have to say. Death's Head in Wolfenstein: The New Order is a personal favourite example of this. Over the course of the tutorial, you're introduced to Fergus, the cool Scottish pilot, and Wyatt, a scared rookie, and you're given just enough time to get attached to the two of them before Death's Head captures you and makes you choose between them. The one you pick to sacrifice is dead forever. It's the sheer sadism of what you're asked to do that turns Death's Head from a fairly generic evil Nazi into someone you can't wait to get revenge on. Death's Head doesn't reappear in person until the end of the game, but his presence is felt throughout. He and the equally horrible Frau Engel give a face to the otherwise faceless Nazi regime. Both of these characters are actually fairly minor presences in terms of the game's actual plot, appearing in 4 levels between them, but the way your few interactions with these characters manipulate your emotions brilliantly gets you into BJ Blazkowicz's frame of mind and sets the tone for the rest of the game. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, humour can also be a phenomenal tool for giving a villain depth and ensuring a player cares about them. GLaDOS from the Portal games is perhaps one of the best and most elegant uses of this particular technique. When you get right down to it, GLaDOS is actually a pretty hackneyed evil AI gone rogue trope. It's in her humour and the way that characterises not just her, but also her relationship with Chell, the player character, that she really stands out. See, the great thing about a funny villain who's good with a quip is that audience are inclined to listen to what they have to say. When you're first taken off guard by GLaDOS, the helpful tutorial robot, outright lying to you in Test Chamber 5, you're conditioned to always listen in when GLaDOS speaks and analyse what she says in order to catch the jokes.
As part of a required test protocol, our previous statement suggesting that we would not monitor this chamber was an outright fabrication.
By the time Test Chamber 9 has rolled around, your relationship has evolved again.
The Enrichment Center regrets to inform you that this next test is impossible. Make no attempt to solve it.
This line signifies a shift from you doing what GLaDOS tells you to you actively defying her helpful advice. Of course, once the end of the game rolls around and it's revealed that the cake was a lie, we're only able to appreciate the twist and our final confrontation with GLaDOS because we've gotten to know her over the course of the game and internalise her undying hatred for us. Video games are, at their core, a storytelling medium, and whilst not every story needs a villain, a lot of gaming narratives really stand to benefit from a compelling antagonist or two. Just consider how much less interesting Shadow of Mordor's actual villain is, whose name I had to look up, it's the Black Hand of Sauron by the way, compared to the systemic enemies created by the Nemesis system, which turns random orcs into bad guys with quirks and characters based on the player's history with them. Simply by injecting a bit of personality, and giving each Nemesis a unique flair, it's much easier for players to create an emergent story around these characters, and thus feel more motivated to engage with and destroy them as a result. The same is true for other games as well. Civilization's leaders, or XCOM 2's Chosen, are ultimately just NPCs, executing simplistic instructions, but by giving them a bit of flavour, we're able to latch onto them and create a story in our heads around their ultimately fairly random actions. Really, what this video comes down to is that while video games are constantly making massive strides in graphical fidelity, creative game mechanics, and jiggle physics technology, our understanding of video game storytelling is still very much in its infancy. For too long, a lot of developers and critics alike have approached gameplay and narrative as two opposing forces. But as the best gaming villains like Handsome Jack or Bumface prove, that's not the case at all. Telling better stories isn't a matter of making flashier cutscenes or paying interns to write more lore, it comes down to an understanding of character, thematics, and most importantly, the unique ways audiences experience interactive stories. And villains are a fantastic intersection of all three and are worthy of putting more effort into. To put what we've learned today into practice, allow me to tell you that you're a fucking idiot and there's no way you'll be able to summon the brainpower required to like, comment and subscribe. I bet you'd really show me if you somehow managed to do that. Yeah! Is this working? Hi and welcome to the end of the video thing that I do all the time. You doing alright? Good? Awesome. If you need something to pass the time during hopefully the back half of the great 2020 lockdown, might I recommend listening to North Star Rising, which is a cool sci-fi podcast written by one of my favourite video game writers, Mike Bithell, and starring a bunch of cool people like Raoul Coley, Scrupulous Pip, and Samantha Bird. It's good. Go and watch it, you might like it. But the people you should be looking out for are my cool patrons. If you want to support the channel and get my personal permission to use adblock, then please consider giving me some money. If you're generous enough to give me $10 a month, you'll get to join the illustrious list of people who get their name read out at the end of each video, like these wonderful people. Who are Alex Deloch, Alexander Kramer, Asaran, Baxter Heel, Big Chess, Bodhi, Brian Notariani, Daniel Metjes, David Dubatrascu, David Sester, Dirk Jan Karembeld, Doodlehog, Evie, Ibathon, Jordan, Joshua Binswanger, Kai Gillespie, Lee Berman, Lucas Slack, Lunar Eagle 1996, Mace Window 54, Max Filipov, Michael Kunk, Mr. T with some tea, Patrick Romberg, Philby the Bilby, Prospero, Ray's Dad, Samuel Vanderplatz, Sheldon Hearn, Steve Riley, Strateger in Ultima, and Chow. Okay, I've got to go. Have a nice day. Remember to play good games and bow before my wrath. Bye.